My name is Rebecca Martinez, and I'm 27 years old. I was hanging streamers in our tiny Phoenix apartment when my phone buzzed. Emma, my 5-year-old daughter, was spinning around in her new birthday dress, asking for the 100th time if Grandma and Grandpa were really coming this time. The text from my mom made my heart sink. "We're skipping your kid's birthday, things are tight." I quickly typed back no problem with a smile emoji, but my hands were shaking. Things are tight? I thought, staring at the photo on Facebook of my parents at another expensive restaurant just last night. Before we dive into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe for more family drama stories. Trust me, what happened next will shock you about what some families will do for money. You won't believe how far my own parents were willing to go to keep me in the dark. Growing up in Scottsdale, Arizona, I lived in what everyone called the perfect American family. My father, Richard Martinez, owned the largest real estate development company in the state, building luxury communities that sprawled across the desert like golden kingdoms. My mother, Margaret, spent her days organizing charity galas and country club events, her perfectly manicured nails never touching anything more strenuous than a wine glass. Our house sat on 2 acres with a pool that could accommodate 50 people, and every Christmas looked like something out of a magazine. But perfection, I learned early, came with a price. My older brother Daniel was everything my parents wanted in a child. He played varsity football, maintained straight A's, dated the homecoming queen, and never questioned the path laid out for him toward Harvard Business School. I, on the other hand, was what my mother called spirited and my father termed difficult. I preferred books to parties, asked uncomfortable questions about our housekeeper's wages, and had the audacity to get pregnant at 17. The day I told my parents about the baby, the carefully constructed facade of our perfect family cracked down the middle like Arizona pavement in summer heat. My father's face turned the color of desert sand, and my mother immediately started talking about options and fixing this mistake. When I refused their solution, they gave me an ultimatum: give up the baby for adoption or leave their house forever. I chose my daughter. Emma's father, Jake, disappeared the moment he heard about the pregnancy, leaving me with nothing but a broken heart and a growing belly. My parents' financial support evaporated overnight. The credit cards were canceled, the car repossessed, and I found myself working 3 jobs while finishing high school through night classes. I scrubbed floors at a hotel before dawn, served lunch at a diner, and stocked shelves at a grocery store until midnight, all while my belly grew rounder and my dreams grew smaller. Now, 10 years later, I work as a dental assistant making $32,000 a year, living paycheck to paycheck in a 700-square-foot apartment where the air conditioning barely works and the walls are so thin we can hear our neighbor's television. Emma shares my bedroom because we can't afford a 2-bedroom place, and every month is a careful dance between rent, groceries, and keeping our ancient Honda Civic running. Emma asks about her grandparents constantly, wondering why other kids have grandparents who pick them up from school and take them to ice cream, while hers never visit. I've told her they live far away and are very busy, but she's getting old enough to start questioning why they never call on her birthday or send Christmas presents. The truth is, they live 20 minutes away in a house worth $2 million, but they've never even asked to meet her. Last week, scrolling through Facebook during my lunch break, I saw the photos that made my stomach twist into knots. My parents at Mastro's Steakhouse, celebrating their 32nd wedding anniversary with a bottle of wine that costs more than I make in a week. Daniel's new Tesla Model S parked in their driveway, a $60,000 graduation present for finishing his MBA. My sister Jennifer's elaborate wedding photos from last month, a celebration that reportedly cost more than I'll make in 3 years. But according to my mother's text, things are tight for a 5-year-old's birthday party that would cost maybe $50 for cake and decorations. The math didn't add up, and for the first time in years, I started wondering what was really going on with my family's money. I waited until Emma was asleep that night before calling my mother, my hands trembling as I dialed the number I still knew by heart despite using it so rarely. Margaret answered on the 4th ring, her voice crisp and professional as always, as if she were taking a business call rather than speaking to her own daughter. "Rebecca, what do you need?" She asked without any pleasantries, the coldness in her tone making me feel like I was 17 again, standing in their marble foyer with a positive pregnancy test in my shaking hands. I just wanted to talk about Emma's birthday, I said carefully, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. I saw your text, and I understand if money is tight right now. I just thought maybe you and Dad could stop by for an hour, even without presents. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped, then Margaret's laugh cut through the phone like broken glass. Rebecca, we have our priorities. Daniel just started his new job, and Jennifer is planning her honeymoon. We simply don't have time for children's parties right now. But it's your granddaughter, I whispered, the words catching in my throat. She's 5 years old, Mom. She asks about you every single day. That's unfortunate, but it's not our responsibility. You made your choices 10 years ago, and we've moved on with our lives. Perhaps if you'd made better decisions, you wouldn't be in this situation. Before I could respond, I heard my father's voice in the background, gruff and dismissive. Tell her we're leaving for the airport in an hour. The car service will be here soon. Airport? I hadn't heard anything about a trip. Where are you going? I asked. Margaret's pause told me everything I needed to know. We have business to attend to, she said finally, but I could hear the lie in her voice. After hanging up, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to Emma's peaceful breathing and scrolling through social media like a woman possessed. At 2 a.m, I found what I was looking for. Daniel's Instagram story showed him at Sky Harbor Airport with our parents, all of them dressed in expensive casual clothes and looking excited. The location tag read, departing PHX, next stop, London. London. They were going to London for a week-long vacation that probably cost more than I make in 6 months, leaving town the day before Emma's birthday so they wouldn't have to deal with the inconvenience of acknowledging their granddaughter's existence. Emma woke up the next morning asking if today was the day Grandma and Grandpa were coming, and I had to tell her they couldn't make it after all. I watched her little face crumble, and something inside me broke. She didn't cry, she just nodded and said okay, Mommy, in the bravest voice a 5-year-old could manage, and that hurt more than any tears would have. My coworker Sarah noticed my mood at work and offered to help with the party. My kids love birthday parties, she said kindly. We'll bring balloons and help you set up. It'll be fun. But even Sarah's generosity couldn't fill the hole left by my family's absence. That evening, my sister Jennifer called with what she claimed was sympathy but sounded more like gossip hunting. I heard Mom and Dad couldn't make Emma's party, she said, her voice dripping with false concern. That's such a shame. Yeah, they said money was tight, I replied, testing the waters. Jennifer's uncomfortable laugh told me she knew exactly how ridiculous that sounded. Well, you know how they are about budgeting, she said weakly. Then, as if she couldn't help herself, she added, did you see the photos from my wedding? They really went all out. Dad said it was worth every penny to see me happy. Every penny. My parents had paid for Jennifer's entire wedding celebration for 200 guests at the Arizona Biltmore, complete with a live band, gourmet catering, and an open bar that probably cost more than most people's cars. But they couldn't spare $50 and 2 hours for their granddaughter's 5th birthday. Emma fell asleep that night whispering questions into her pillow that she thought I couldn't hear. Why don't I have grandparents like Sarah's kids? Did I do something wrong? Are they mad at me? Each question was like a knife twisting in my heart, and I realized that my family's rejection wasn't just hurting me anymore. It was damaging an innocent child who had done nothing wrong except exist. For the first time in 10 years, I stopped making excuses for them. The rage that I'd been swallowing for a decade finally started rising to the surface, and with it came a dangerous new thought. Maybe it was time to find out exactly what my family had been hiding from me all these years. The next morning, after dropping Emma at kindergarten, I drove to the Maricopa County Recorder's office instead of going straight to work. I'd called in sick, which I never do, but something inside me had snapped during those early morning hours listening to Emma's whispered questions. If my parents could afford London vacations and $60,000 cars while claiming poverty about a child's birthday party, I needed to understand exactly what was going on. The public records search revealed information that made my hands shake as I scrolled through the documents on the computer terminal. My father's company, Martinez Development Group, had just closed on a $20 million land deal in North Scottsdale. $20 million. The property taxes alone on their house were more than my entire annual salary. This wasn't a family struggling with tight finances. This was a family swimming in wealth while letting their daughter and granddaughter struggle to survive. But the most shocking discovery came when I searched for family trust documents. There it was, in black and white legal language that made my stomach churn: the Martinez Family Trust, established 15 years ago, with provisions for distributions to qualified family members. The document listed beneficiaries as Richard Martinez, Margaret Martinez, Daniel Martinez, Jennifer Martinez, and any future grandchildren born to Daniel or Jennifer. My name was nowhere on the list, and neither was Emma's. I sat staring at that computer screen for 20 minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. Not only had my parents cut me off financially when I got pregnant, they'd systematically excluded me from any future family wealth. Emma would never see a penny of her grandfather's money, not for college, not for emergencies, not for anything, while her cousins would inherit millions. The research consumed me over the following weeks. During lunch breaks and after Emma went to bed, I dug deeper into my family's financial empire. Daniel had been receiving monthly distributions of $5,000 from the family trust since he turned 21, money that had paid for his apartment during college, his car, his study abroad trips, and probably the down payment on his new house. Jennifer had received similar distributions, plus a special disbursement of $50,000 for her wedding. When I finally worked up the courage to confront Jennifer about what I'd discovered, she agreed to meet me at a coffee shop near her work, but she looked nervous from the moment she sat down. "What's this about, Rebecca?" she asked, fidgeting with her new designer purse, another gift from our parents. "I know about the trust," I said simply, watching her face go pale. "I know about Daniel's monthly payments. I know about your wedding money. I know about all of it." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of guilt. "Rebecca, you have to understand, it wasn't my idea. Mom and Dad, they made us promise not to tell you. They said it would just make you bitter and angry." Bitter and angry about what? About being completely cut out of my own family's wealth while struggling to feed my daughter? About watching my child grow up in poverty while her cousins get trust funds? "They said you made your choice when you kept Emma," Jennifer whispered, unable to meet my eyes. "They said if you wanted family money, you should have listened to them in the first place." The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, the air too thick to breathe. "How long?" I asked. "How long have you all been having family meetings without me? How long have you been making financial decisions that affect Emma's future without including us?" Jennifer's silence was answer enough, but then she spoke the words that nearly broke me: "Since Emma was born. Every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, every major holiday. We discuss the trust, the investments, the distributions. Mom keeps a spreadsheet of everyone's allocations." She paused, then added the devastating detail: she started college funds for Daniel's future children before he even got married. But when I asked about Emma, she said that wasn't something we needed to worry about. I left that coffee shop feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach, but I also felt something else: determination. My family thought they could erase me and Emma from their lives while we struggled to survive, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd documented everything in legal papers, and those papers could be challenged. The first ally in what would become a war came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who'd been my grandmother's best friend, called me that evening out of the blue. "Rebecca, dear, I've been thinking about you and your little girl," she said in her gentle voice. "Would you like to come for tea this weekend? There's something I need to discuss with you about your grandmother." Mrs. Chen lived in the same neighborhood where I'd grown up, in a modest house that contrasted sharply with my parents' mansion just a few blocks away. When I arrived with Emma, she welcomed us both with warm hugs and homemade cookies, treating my daughter with the grandmotherly affection that had been missing from her life. "Your grandmother loved you very much," Mrs. Chen said after Emma was playing in the garden. "She was heartbroken when your parents cut you off. She tried to change their minds many times before she died." "I miss her," I said simply. Grandmother Martinez had been the only family member who'd supported my decision to keep Emma, though she'd died when Emma was just 2 years old. Mrs. Chen nodded, then disappeared into her house for several minutes. When she returned, she carried a manila envelope that looked old and official. "Your grandmother gave this to me before she passed," she said, placing it in my hands. "She made me promise to give it to you when the time was right. I think that time is now." Inside the envelope were photocopies of legal documents that made my heart race. My grandmother had left me $200,000 in her will, money that was supposed to be held in trust until I turned 25, then transferred to my control. The documents were dated 3 years before her death, and according to the paperwork, I should have received this inheritance 2 years ago. But I'd never heard a word about any inheritance. Not from my parents, not from the family lawyer, not from anyone. As far as I knew, my grandmother's estate had been distributed among my parents and their other relatives, with nothing left for the granddaughter who'd disappointed the family. Looking at those documents, I realized that my parents' betrayal went even deeper than I'd imagined. It wasn't just about excluding me from future wealth. They'd actively stolen money that was rightfully mine, money that my grandmother had specifically wanted me to have to help me build a better life for myself and Emma. The war I was about to wage wouldn't just be about family dynamics or hurt feelings. It would be about recovering stolen inheritance money that could change Emma's entire future, money that could pay for her college education and give her opportunities that my parents thought she didn't deserve. But I also realized that taking on my family's wealth and legal power would be the fight of my life, and I wasn't sure I was strong enough to win. Mrs. Chen's revelation about my grandmother's will changed everything, but it also raised terrifying questions about how deep my parents' deception really went. The next morning, I used my lunch break to call estate attorney Thomas Wright, whose name appeared on the legal documents Mrs. Chen had given me. His secretary initially tried to brush me off, but when I mentioned my grandmother's name and the $200,000 bequest, she quickly transferred me to the lawyer himself. "Ms. Martinez," Thomas Wright said, his voice cautious but interested. "I haven't heard from anyone in your family about this matter in quite some time. When can you come in to discuss your grandmother's estate?" That afternoon, sitting in his downtown Phoenix office surrounded by law books and framed diplomas, I learned the full scope of my parents' betrayal. According to Wright, my grandmother had indeed left me $200,000, but when he'd tried to contact me about the inheritance, my parents had intercepted all communications. They'd provided him with what they claimed was my current address and phone number, but both had been fake. "I sent multiple certified letters to the address your parents provided," Wright explained, pulling a thick file from his cabinet. "They all came back as undeliverable. When I called the phone number, it was disconnected. Your parents told me you'd moved out of state and didn't want contact with the family." The methodical nature of their deception was breathtaking. My parents hadn't just passively excluded me from family wealth, they'd actively forged documents and provided false information to prevent me from receiving my inheritance. When Wright had been unable to locate me within the required time frame, the money had reverted to the residual estate, which meant it had gone to my parents. "There's more," Wright continued, his expression grim. "Your grandmother also established a small trust fund for any great-grandchildren, specifically mentioning your future children in the documents. That fund currently contains about $75,000 that should have been set aside for Emma's education." So not only had my parents stolen my inheritance, they'd also stolen Emma's college fund. My grandmother, who had died believing that her money would help her great-granddaughter get a good education, had been betrayed by her own son and daughter-in-law. But Wright also delivered sobering news about the legal challenges we'd face. The statute of limitations on challenging this kind of estate fraud is typically 3 years from when the inheritance should have been distributed, he explained. We're cutting it very close. If we're going to pursue this, we need to act immediately. The legal fees alone would be daunting, probably more than I made in 6 months, but Wright agreed to work on a contingency basis if the evidence was strong enough to guarantee a win. We spent the next 2 hours going through every document, every communication, every piece of evidence that proved my parents had deliberately kept me from receiving my inheritance. That weekend was Emma's 5th birthday party, and despite everything that was happening, I was determined to make it special for her. Sarah and her family came over with balloons and presents, and our elderly neighbor brought homemade cupcakes. Emma laughed and played and seemed genuinely happy, but during the cake ceremony, she made a wish that broke my heart. I wished for grandparents who love me, she whispered to me later that night as I tucked her into bed. Sarah's kids have grandparents who come to their birthdays and bring presents and hug them. Why don't I have that, Mommy? How do you explain to a 5-year-old that her grandparents live 20 minutes away but choose not to know her because they're punishing her mother for decisions made long before she was born? How do you tell a child that she's been deemed unworthy of love and financial support by people who've never even met her? Some people don't know how to love the way they should, I told her finally. But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. You are perfect and wonderful and deserving of all the love in the world. But privately, I was furious. My parents weren't just hurting me anymore, they were damaging an innocent child who asked for nothing more than acknowledgement of her existence. Every time Emma asked about grandparents, every time she watched other kids get picked up by doting grandparents while she waited alone with me, every time she wondered why she didn't have the extended family support that other children took for granted, my parents were causing her pain. The inheritance money wasn't just about my financial security anymore. It was about Emma's future, about giving her opportunities for college and career training that I could never afford on my dental assistant salary. It was about providing her with the financial foundation that my grandmother had specifically wanted her to have. Mrs. Chen became my unofficial advisor during this time, sharing stories about my grandmother's determination to help me despite my parents' objections. Your grandmother knew what kind of people your parents really were, she told me one afternoon while Emma played in her garden. She saw how they treated you after you got pregnant, and it disgusted her. She changed her will specifically to make sure you'd be taken care of after she died. Through Mrs. Chen, I also learned about Uncle Martin, my father's younger brother who'd always been the black sheep of the Martinez family. Martin had tried to intervene when my parents cut me off financially, arguing that families should stick together regardless of circumstances. When his efforts failed, he distanced himself from the family, but Mrs. Chen thought he might be willing to testify about what he'd witnessed. The evidence was building, but so was the risk. Challenging my parents meant going to war with people who had unlimited resources and no moral qualms about destroying me to protect their secrets. They'd already proven they were willing to commit fraud to keep money from me and Emma. What would they do if they realized I'd discovered their crimes and was preparing to expose them? But every time I felt scared, I thought about Emma's whispered birthday wish and my grandmother's love for us both. My parents had counted on my silence, my poverty, and my fear to keep their secrets safe. They'd assumed I'd never have the resources or the courage to challenge them. They were about to learn how wrong they were about the lengths a mother will go to protect her child's future. Thomas Wright's office became my second home over the following weeks as we built what he called an airtight case for inheritance fraud. The evidence was overwhelming: forged addresses, fake phone numbers, intercepted legal documents, and clear proof that my parents had provided false information to prevent me from receiving my rightful inheritance. But Wright warned me that my parents wouldn't go down without a vicious fight. Rich people don't just roll over when you challenge their money, he explained during one of our preparation sessions. They'll hire the most expensive lawyers in the state, and they'll try to destroy your credibility in every way possible. Are you prepared for that kind of war? I thought about Emma asking why she didn't have grandparents who loved her, and my answer was immediate. I'm prepared for whatever it takes. The first sign that my parents suspected something came through Daniel, who showed up at my apartment on a Tuesday evening with flowers and an awkward smile. We hadn't spoken in months, and his sudden appearance made my stomach clench with suspicion. "Hey, sis," he said, using the childhood nickname he'd abandoned years ago. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. Maybe meet my niece properly for the first time." Emma was thrilled to finally meet the uncle she'd heard about but never seen, and Daniel was surprisingly good with her, bringing her a stuffed animal and listening patiently to her stories about kindergarten. But I could see through his performance to the nervous energy underneath, the way his eyes kept darting to me as if he was trying to read my thoughts. After Emma went to bed, Daniel's real purpose became clear. "Mom and Dad feel bad about missing Emma's birthday," he said, settling into my tiny living room like he belonged there. "They're thinking about setting up some kind of college fund for her, maybe starting with a small amount to see how it goes." The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. "That's interesting," I said carefully. "What made them change their minds?" Daniel shrugged, but his casual demeanor was clearly forced. "I guess they're getting older, thinking about family legacy and stuff. They asked me to feel out whether you'd be interested in rebuilding the relationship." I realized this was a fishing expedition. My parents had sent Daniel to gauge whether I knew about the inheritance fraud, whether I was planning any legal action, whether their secrets were still safe. The fact that they were suddenly interested in Emma's education after years of ignoring her existence meant they suspected I'd discovered something. "Tell them I appreciate the offer," I said, "but Emma and I are doing fine on our own. We don't need their guilt money." Daniel's face tightened slightly, and I could see him making mental notes to report back to our parents. The conversation continued for another hour, with him asking casual questions about my finances, my future plans, and whether I'd been in touch with any of grandmother's old friends. I answered everything with carefully neutral responses, revealing nothing while gathering intelligence about their concerns. After he left, I immediately called Thomas Wright to report the contact. "They know something's up," he said grimly. "This college fund offer is probably an attempt to muddy the waters legally, to make it look like they were always planning to help Emma financially. We need to file the papers immediately." But before we could move forward, my sister Jennifer delivered another devastating betrayal. She called Wright's office directly and told his secretary that I was mentally unstable, claiming that I'd been making threats against our parents and fabricating stories about inheritance money. She provided a detailed account of supposed conversations where I'd allegedly threatened violence and made wild accusations about family finances. "She's clearly having some kind of breakdown," Jennifer had told the secretary. "My parents are afraid for their safety. Rebecca has always been unstable, and becoming a single mother just made it worse." Wright was professional about relaying the message, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. Character assassination was a common tactic in inheritance disputes, and my parents had chosen their weapon carefully. Who would believe a struggling single mother over a respected business family with community connections and unlimited resources? "We need character witnesses," Wright explained. "People who can testify about your mental stability, your relationship with your grandmother, and your parents' treatment of you over the years." Sarah agreed to testify about my character and work ethic, describing how I'd been a reliable employee and dedicated mother despite financial struggles. Mrs. Chen provided written testimony about my grandmother's wishes and my parents' behavior after Emma was born. But our most powerful potential witness was Uncle Martin, who'd witnessed the family dynamics firsthand. Martin agreed to meet me at a quiet restaurant in Tempe, away from our parents' neighborhood and social circle. He looked older than I remembered, grayer and more tired, but his anger about the family situation was immediately apparent. "I've been waiting for someone to challenge Richard and Margaret," he said bluntly. "What they did to you was unconscionable, and what they're doing to that little girl is worse. Your grandmother was furious about the whole situation before she died." Martin's testimony would be crucial because he'd been present during family meetings where my parents had discussed their strategy for keeping me excluded from family wealth. He'd heard them laugh about my financial struggles and refer to Emma as that bastard child when they thought no one was listening. Richard bragged about intercepting the lawyer's letters, Martin revealed. He thought it was clever, covering their tracks so you'd never know about the inheritance. Margaret said it served you right for refusing their advice about the baby. But Martin also warned me about the viciousness of the battle ahead. Your parents will stop at nothing to protect their money and reputation, he said. They've spent years building their image as pillars of the community. If this becomes public, it'll destroy everything they've worked for, and they know it. The legal papers were filed on December 20th, exactly 3 years and 1 day before the statute of limitations would have expired. Right Hand delivered them to my parents' house during their annual Christmas party, ensuring that their guests and neighbors would witness the humiliation of being served legal documents. The reaction was swift and brutal. Within hours, I received a call from Child Protective Services reporting that an anonymous caller had raised concerns about Emma's welfare. Someone had claimed that I was using drugs, leaving my child unsupervised, and living in unsafe conditions. The caller had provided detailed information about our address, my work schedule, and Emma's school, suggesting intimate knowledge of our daily lives. The CPS investigation was the most terrifying experience of my life. A social worker arrived at our apartment unannounced, inspecting every room, questioning Emma about her daily routine, and taking photographs of our living conditions. Emma was confused and frightened by the stranger asking her personal questions, and I had to struggle to remain calm while my world felt like it was collapsing. Someone's made some serious allegations, the social worker explained. We have to investigate every report, regardless of the source. The investigation ultimately cleared me of any wrongdoing, but the message was clear: my parents were willing to weaponize the child welfare system to intimidate me into dropping the inheritance case. They were prepared to put Emma through trauma and potentially destroy our family to protect their stolen money. That night, as I held my sleeping daughter and listened to her peaceful breathing, I realized that this wasn't just about inheritance anymore. This was about protecting Emma from people who saw her as an obstacle to their wealth and reputation, people who were willing to harm a child to maintain their secrets. The war was just beginning, and my parents had already shown they would use any weapon available to destroy us. Christmas morning arrived with an irony that would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. While other families were opening presents and sharing holiday meals, my parents were being served with additional legal documents charging them with inheritance fraud, elder financial abuse, and conspiracy to defraud an estate. Thomas Wright had timed the service for maximum impact, knowing that my parents always hosted their annual Christmas brunch for 50 of Phoenix's most prominent families. The reaction was everything Wright had hoped for and everything I'd feared. By noon, my phone was ringing with calls from family members I hadn't spoken to in years, all of them outraged that I'd dared to challenge the family patriarch. My cousin Maria called me a money-grubbing witch and accused me of destroying the family for personal gain. Aunt Patricia left a voicemail calling me mentally ill and threatening to testify against my character in court. But the real retaliation began that afternoon. My father's real estate company employed half the contractors and service providers in Scottsdale, and he began using that influence systematically. The dental office where I worked received anonymous complaints about my unprofessional behavior and questionable character. Dr. Harrison, my boss, called me into his office looking uncomfortable and concerned. "Rebecca, I've gotten some strange phone calls about you," he said carefully. "People claiming you're involved in some kind of family scandal, that you're not trustworthy around money or children. I don't believe any of it, but I wanted you to know what's being said." The whisper campaign was methodical and vicious. My parents were using their social connections to spread rumors about my mental stability, my fitness as a mother, and my motivations for the lawsuit. At Emma's school, other parents began giving me strange looks and whispering when I arrived for pickup. The school secretary, who'd always been friendly, suddenly became cold and professional. Daniel's role in the character assassination became clear when I discovered he'd been contacting my coworkers and acquaintances, claiming to be concerned about my deteriorating mental state. He told people that I'd become obsessed with conspiracy theories about family money, that I was neglecting Emma while pursuing frivolous lawsuits, and that the family was considering intervention to protect my daughter. The campaign nearly succeeded in destroying my employment. 3 weeks after Christmas, Dr. Harrison called me in again, this time with a much grimmer expression. "Rebecca, I've received a formal complaint about you from a patient," he said. "They're claiming you were unprofessional and appeared to be under the influence of something during their appointment." I knew the complaint was fabricated because I'd never used drugs in my life and was meticulous about professionalism at work, but the allegation was serious enough to trigger a workplace investigation. The stress was affecting my performance, and I could see doubt creeping into my boss's eyes despite his previous support. "I'm going to need you to take a drug test and attend a workplace counseling session," Dr. Harrison said reluctantly. "I'm sorry, but with these allegations, I have to follow protocol." Emma was bearing the brunt of the family war in ways that broke my heart. The stress was affecting her behavior at school, and she'd started having nightmares about strangers taking her away from me. The CPS investigation had traumatized her more than I'd initially realized, and she'd become clingy and anxious, afraid to let me out of her sight. "Mommy, are the bad people going to take me away?" she asked one night after another nightmare. "Sarah's mom said people are saying mean things about us." The fact that my parents' campaign was affecting other parents at Emma's school, turning neighbors and friends against us, made me realize how deep their influence ran in our community. They weren't just attacking me, they were systematically isolating Emma and me from every support system we had. But the cruelest weapon came when my parents hired their own legal team and filed a countersuit claiming that I was an unfit mother who was using my daughter to extort money from family members. Their petition requested temporary custody of Emma pending a full investigation of my mental stability and living conditions. Thomas Wright called me immediately when the papers were filed. "This is a nuclear option," he said, his voice grim. "They're trying to take Emma away from you to force you to drop the inheritance case. No mother would continue a lawsuit if it meant losing her child." The custody threat was the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to me. My parents had the resources to hire the best family law attorneys in the state, they had community standing and character witnesses, and they'd been building a case that I was mentally unstable and financially desperate. On paper, they could argue that Emma would be better off with financially stable grandparents who could provide her with opportunities one never could. For the first time since this battle began, I seriously considered surrender. Sitting in my tiny apartment looking at Emma's toys scattered across our worn carpet, I wondered if my parents might be right. Maybe Emma would be better off with them. Maybe I was being selfish by putting her through this trauma to pursue money that might not even matter in the long run. Sarah found me crying that night and refused to leave until I'd told her everything. "You cannot let them take that little girl," she said fiercely. "They don't want Emma because they love her. They want her because she's a weapon they can use against you. What kind of grandparents try to destroy a child's mother? What kind of people use the legal system to terrorize their own family?" Her words snapped me back to reality. My parents weren't trying to rescue Emma from an unfit mother, they were trying to kidnap her to maintain control over stolen inheritance money. They'd spent 5 years ignoring her existence, and now they suddenly wanted custody? Their true motivations were transparent to anyone paying attention. Mrs. Chen offered to let Emma stay with her during the worst of the legal proceedings, providing a safe haven away from the constant stress and fear that had taken over our lives. Uncle Martin increased his support, providing detailed testimony about my parents' character and their treatment of both me and Emma over the years. But the most unexpected ally came from Jennifer, who finally reached her breaking point. After weeks of watching her parents' vicious campaign against their own granddaughter, she called Thomas Wright's office and asked to speak with him directly. "I can't do this anymore," she told him. "What my parents are doing to Rebecca and Emma is wrong, and I can't be part of it. I want to testify for Rebecca's side." Jennifer's defection marked the turning point in the family war. As someone who'd been present for every family meeting and financial decision over the past 10 years, her testimony could expose the full scope of my parents' deception and prove their pattern of deliberately excluding Emma from family resources. But her decision to switch sides also escalated the stakes dramatically. My parents now faced the possibility of criminal charges for inheritance fraud, public humiliation for their treatment of their granddaughter, and financial penalties that could cost them millions. They'd fought dirty so far, but now they were truly desperate. The final phase of the war was about to begin, and I knew they would use every weapon in their considerable arsenal to destroy me before I could expose their crimes. February brought the lowest point of my life since Emma's birth. The combined pressure of the custody battle, the inheritance lawsuit, and my parents' relentless character assassination campaign had pushed me to the breaking point. I was barely sleeping, constantly anxious about losing my job, and terrified that Emma might actually be taken from me by people who'd spent 5 years pretending she didn't exist. The harassment campaign had intensified after Jennifer's defection. My parents, realizing they'd lost a crucial ally and potential witness, doubled down on their efforts to destroy my credibility. They hired a private investigator who followed me to work, photographed my apartment building, and questioned my neighbors about my suspicious behavior. The investigator posed as a concerned citizen asking about drug activity in the building, clearly trying to manufacture evidence of illegal activity that could support their custody claim. Dr. Harrison called me into his office again in mid-February with news that nearly destroyed me. "Rebecca, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to let you go," he said, unable to meet my eyes. "The complaints about you haven't stopped, and now patients are specifically requesting not to work with you. I can't run a business under these conditions." Losing my job was catastrophic. Without steady income, I couldn't afford our apartment rent, Emma's daycare, or even basic groceries. My parents had successfully used their influence to make me unemployable in our community, proving that their threats about having resources to destroy me weren't empty bluster. The unemployment also strengthened their custody case. Their lawyers immediately filed additional paperwork arguing that I'd lost my job due to mental instability and substance abuse issues, and that Emma needed the stability only her grandparents could provide. They conveniently omitted the fact that their harassment campaign had caused my job loss in the first place. Emma's behavior deteriorated as the stress affected our entire household. She stopped eating regularly, began wetting the bed again, and developed a stutter that broke my heart every time she struggled to speak. The confident, happy little girl who'd celebrated her 5th birthday just months earlier was disappearing, replaced by an anxious child who clung to me constantly and asked repeatedly if we were going to be okay. "Mommy, are we going to be homeless?" she asked one night as I tried to stretch our last $20 to buy groceries for the week. "Sarah's mom says people who don't have jobs can't pay for their houses." The fact that neighborhood gossip had reached Emma's ears, that other parents were discussing our situation in front of their children, showed how thoroughly my parents had poisoned our community against us. Emma was being damaged not just by the legal battle, but by the social isolation and whispered conversations she was too young to understand but old enough to absorb. Thomas Wright was growing concerned about my ability to continue the fight. "I believe in this case completely," he told me during a particularly difficult meeting. "The evidence of inheritance fraud is overwhelming, and your parents' behavior throughout this process has been unconscionable. But I'm worried about what this is costing you and Emma personally." He was right to be worried. I'd lost 20 pounds from stress and poor nutrition, my hands shook constantly from anxiety, and I'd started having panic attacks that left me gasping for breath in grocery store aisles. The woman who'd been strong enough to raise a daughter alone while working multiple jobs was disappearing, replaced by someone who could barely function under the weight of legal pressure and financial terror. The absolute lowest point came when CPS made a second visit to our apartment, this time with a court order for a comprehensive home study. The same social worker who'd cleared us months earlier returned with a different attitude, asking invasive questions about my job loss, my mental health, and my ability to provide for Emma's basic needs. "I have reports that you've been unable to maintain employment," she said, taking notes while Emma sat silently on the couch, wide-eyed and frightened. "There are also concerns about your living situation and whether it's stable enough for a child." The home study felt like a violation of everything I'd worked to build. The social worker photographed our nearly empty refrigerator, noted the disconnect notice from the electric company, and documented every sign of our financial distress. Emma answered questions about whether Mommy seemed sad or scared, whether we had enough food, and whether she felt safe in our home. That night, after Emma finally fell asleep, I sat on our bathroom floor and seriously considered giving up the inheritance fight. Maybe my parents were right. Maybe Emma would be better off with them. They could provide her with private schools, college funds, and opportunities one could never afford. All I had to offer was love, and sometimes love wasn't enough to overcome poverty and instability. Sarah found me there at midnight, having used her emergency key when I didn't answer her concerned phone calls. "You cannot give up now," she said, sitting on the bathroom floor beside me. "Look at what they've done to you and Emma just to protect money they stole. Look at the lengths they've gone to terrorize their own family. These are not people who should have custody of a child." Her words penetrated my despair enough to remind me of a crucial truth. My parents didn't want Emma because they loved her. They wanted her because taking her away from me was the ultimate weapon in their campaign to protect their stolen inheritance. Everything they'd done proved they saw Emma not as a beloved granddaughter, but as a problem to be managed. Mrs. Chen provided another lifeline during this dark period. She'd been quietly gathering evidence of my parents' character through their neighborhood and social connections, collecting stories about their treatment of service workers, their attitudes toward people they considered beneath them, and their general reputation among people who knew them privately rather than publicly. "Your parents have made many enemies over the years," she told me. "Rich people often do, especially rich people who look down on others. There are people willing to testify about their true character, not the public image they maintain." Uncle Martin also stepped up his support, offering to pay for Emma's daycare while I searched for new employment and providing character testimony that directly contradicted my parents' claims about family dynamics. His decision to support me came at personal cost, as my parents had already threatened to exclude him from future family financial benefits. "I should have stood up to them years ago," he told me. "I watched them destroy you for making a choice they didn't like, and I stayed silent because it was easier than fighting. But I won't be silent while they try to steal that little girl from her mother." The turning point in my emotional recovery came when Jennifer provided Thomas Wright with copies of emails and text messages between our parents discussing their strategy for the custody battle. The communications revealed the calculated nature of their campaign and their true motivations. "We need to make Rebecca look unstable enough that any judge would prefer the child with us," my mother had written to my father. "The inheritance case will disappear if we have custody of Emma. No court will rule against grandparents who are clearly providing better opportunities." Reading those messages, I realized that my parents had never intended to be loving grandparents to Emma. They'd planned from the beginning to use her as leverage against me, and if they won custody, Emma would grow up knowing that her grandparents had destroyed her mother to get control of her. That realization gave me the strength to fight back. I might be broke, unemployed, and emotionally exhausted, but I was still Emma's mother, and my job was to protect her from people who would damage her to serve their own interests. The inheritance money wasn't just about financial security anymore, it was about justice for Emma and accountability for people who thought their wealth made them immune to consequences. Sarah helped me find a new job at a dental office across town, away from my parents' influence. Mrs. Chen provided temporary financial support to help us catch up on rent. Uncle Martin connected me with other family members who'd been intimidated into silence but were willing to testify about my parents' character. The darkest hour was ending, but the final battle still lay ahead. My parents had shown their true nature through their treatment of Emma and me, and now it was time for a court of law to hold them accountable for their crimes. The Maricopa County Superior Court felt like a cathedral of justice as I walked through its doors on the morning of April 15th, knowing that everything I'd fought for over the past 6 months would be decided in the next few days. Emma stayed with Mrs. Chen during the proceedings, but I carried her picture in my pocket as a reminder of why I was fighting people who had unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. My parents arrived in a black Mercedes with their legal team, for attorneys from the most prestigious firm in Phoenix who'd been hired to destroy my case and my credibility. Margaret wore a conservative navy suit that made her look like the respectable community leader she pretended to be, while Richard's expensive tailored clothing projected successful businessman competence. They'd dressed for the role of concerned grandparents seeking custody of an endangered child. Thomas Wright had prepared me for their strategy, but seeing it executed was still breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. Their lead attorney, Amanda Crawford, painted a picture of me as a mentally unstable single mother who'd fabricated inheritance claims to extort money from respectable family members. According to their narrative, I was using Emma as a weapon against grandparents who'd only tried to help us. My clients have watched their daughter struggle with mental health issues for years, Crawford told the judge during opening statements. They offered financial support multiple times, but Rebecca rejected their help while simultaneously claiming they owed her money from a grandmother's estate. This lawsuit is the desperate act of someone who's lost touch with reality. The lies were so smoothly delivered that I could see doubt flickering across Judge Williams' face. My parents had crafted a story that explained away every piece of evidence while positioning themselves as victims of a disturbed daughter's delusions. Without documentation of their harassment campaign, their character assassination efforts, and their deliberate inheritance fraud, their version sounded entirely plausible. But Thomas Wright had spent months preparing for exactly this strategy. His opening statement methodically destroyed their narrative with documented evidence, recorded conversations, and witness testimony that proved my parents' systematic deception. Your Honor, this case involves inheritance fraud, elder financial abuse, and a calculated campaign to terrorize a young mother and her child, Wright explained. The defendants didn't just steal $200,000 from their daughter. They've spent the last 6 months trying to take her child away to cover up their crimes. The first day of testimony established the inheritance fraud beyond any reasonable doubt. Estate attorney Thomas Wright presented documentation proving that my parents had provided false contact information, intercepted legal communications, and deliberately prevented me from receiving my rightful inheritance. The evidence was so overwhelming that my parents' attorneys didn't even attempt to deny the basic facts. Instead, they argued that my parents had acted in my best interests, claiming they'd been concerned about my ability to handle a large sum of money responsibly. Crawford suggested that my parents had planned to distribute the inheritance gradually once I'd proven my financial stability. My clients were protecting their daughter from herself, Crawford argued. They knew that giving a teenage mother access to $200,000 could have devastating consequences for both Rebecca and her child. But Wright's cross-examination of my father destroyed that defense completely. Under oath, Richard was forced to admit that he'd never attempted to contact me about gradual distribution plans, had never discussed alternative inheritance arrangements, and had simply kept the money for his own use. So you've had Rebecca's inheritance money in your accounts for 3 years? Wright asked. It was being held for safekeeping, my father replied, sweating under the courtroom lights. Safekeeping in accounts that you controlled, earning interest that you kept, being used for expenses that benefited your lifestyle? The money was always intended for Rebecca when the time was right. When would the time have been right, Mr. Martinez? When she turned 30? 40? When you died? Or never? The silence that followed spoke volumes about my parents' real intentions. Daniel's testimony was equally devastating to their case. Wright had subpoenaed him as a hostile witness, and under oath, he was forced to admit the existence of family meetings that excluded me, trust fund distributions that I'd never received, and conversations where my parents had discussed keeping Emma from accessing family resources. Your parents specifically told you that Emma would never receive family financial support? Wright asked. They said that Rebecca had made her choice and would have to live with the consequences, Daniel admitted reluctantly. And those consequences included ensuring that Emma never benefited from family wealth, even money specifically left to her by her great-grandmother? Daniel's uncomfortable silence was answer enough. But the most dramatic moment came when Jennifer took the stand as a witness for my side. Her decision to testify against our parents had cost her their financial support and social approval, but she'd reached a breaking point watching their treatment of Emma. My parents orchestrated a campaign to destroy Rebecca's life when she filed this lawsuit, Jennifer testified, her voice shaking with emotion. They hired investigators to follow her, used their business connections to get her fired, and filed false reports with Child Protective Services to make her look like an unfit mother. Crawford's cross-examination of Jennifer was vicious, attacking her credibility and suggesting that she'd been manipulated by me into betraying her family. But Jennifer held firm, producing text messages and emails that documented our parents' harassment strategy. They told me that taking Emma away from Rebecca was the only way to end the inheritance lawsuit, Jennifer testified. They said that no mother would continue fighting if it meant losing her child. Mrs. Chen's testimony provided crucial context about my grandmother's wishes and my parents' character within their community. Her gentle demeanor contrasted sharply with Crawford's aggressive questioning, and her detailed knowledge of the family dynamics over decades made her a powerful witness. Rebecca's grandmother was heartbroken when Richard and Margaret cut off their daughter, Mrs. Chen testified. She changed her will specifically to ensure that Rebecca would have financial security despite her parents' cruelty. She would be devastated to know that they stole money intended for her granddaughter and great-granddaughter. Uncle Martin's testimony revealed the family power dynamics that had enabled my parents' behavior for years. As someone who'd been present during family financial discussions, he could provide insider knowledge about their decision-making process and their attitudes toward me and Emma. Richard and Margaret have always believed that money gives them the right to control other people's lives, Martin testified. When Rebecca refused to give up her baby, they decided to punish her permanently by ensuring she'd never have access to family resources. They saw Emma not as their granddaughter, but as evidence of Rebecca's defiance that needed to be erased. The most heartbreaking moment came when Judge Williams requested to speak privately with Emma about her living situation and her preferences about custody. Wright had prepared me for this possibility, but knowing that my 5-year-old daughter was being asked to choose between her mother and grandparents she'd never met was devastating. When Emma returned from the judge's chambers, she ran straight to me and buried her face in my shoulder. "I told the nice man that I want to stay with Mommy," she whispered. "I don't want to live with people who make Mommy cry." My parents' final desperate strategy involved Crawford arguing that regardless of the inheritance fraud, Emma would be better off with financially stable grandparents who could provide her with opportunities one couldn't afford. She painted a picture of Emma's future with my parents versus her future with me, emphasizing private schools, college funds, and social advantages. "The court must consider what's best for the child," Crawford argued. "Rebecca may love her daughter, but love doesn't pay for education or provide stability. My clients can offer Emma a life of privilege and opportunity that her mother simply cannot match." But Wright's response highlighted the cruelty underlying that argument. "Your Honor, the defendants are asking this court to reward their inheritance fraud by giving them custody of the very child they've spent years refusing to acknowledge. They want to steal Rebecca's inheritance, then steal her daughter, then claim they're acting in the child's best interests. This is not grandparental love, this is systematic abuse of the legal system to cover up financial crimes." Judge Williams took 2 days to reach his decision, 2 days during which I barely slept or ate while imagining every possible outcome. Emma stayed close to me, sensing the gravity of the situation despite not understanding the legal complexities involved. When we returned to court for the verdict, Judge Williams looked directly at my parents before speaking, his expression showing the disgust that their behavior had inspired. "This court finds overwhelming evidence of inheritance fraud, elder financial abuse, and deliberate interference with estate distribution," he announced. "The defendants' subsequent harassment campaign against their own daughter and granddaughter represents unconscionable behavior that demands both legal and financial consequences." The ruling was everything Wright had hoped for and more than I dared to expect. My parents were ordered to pay the full inheritance amount plus 3 years of interest, legal fees for both sides, and additional damages for emotional distress. The total award exceeded $300,000. But more importantly for Emma's future, Judge Williams rejected the custody petition entirely and issued a restraining order preventing my parents from contacting us without court supervision. The defendants have proven through their actions that they view the minor child not as a beloved granddaughter, but as a weapon to be used against her mother, Judge Williams stated. No court should award custody to individuals who would traumatize a child to protect stolen money. As we left the courthouse, my parents refused to look at me or acknowledge Emma's presence, even though their granddaughter was standing right beside me. Their final act of rejection actually strengthened my resolve, proving that this had never been about love or family relationships. It had always been about money and control. The victory was complete, but the emotional cost had been enormous for everyone involved. I'd won justice for Emma and accountability for my parents, but I'd also permanently destroyed any possibility of family reconciliation. Looking at Emma's innocent face as we walked out into the Phoenix sunshine, I wondered if the price had been worth paying. The months following our court victory brought changes I'd never dared to imagine during the darkest days of our legal battle. The $300,000 settlement transformed our lives practically, but more importantly, it validated Emma's worth as a human being who deserved love and financial security regardless of her grandparents' disapproval of her existence. Our first major change was moving from the cramped apartment where we'd struggled to pay rent into a modest 3-bedroom house in Tempe with a small backyard where Emma could play safely. For the first time in her life, Emma had her own bedroom, decorated with princess themes and filled with books and toys that we could finally afford. Watching her joy as she arranged her stuffed animals on her own bed, knowing that this security was permanent rather than precarious, made every moment of our legal battle worthwhile. I returned to school part-time to study dental hygiene, using the inheritance money to invest in education that would provide long-term financial stability. Emma attended a better elementary school where the teachers didn't know about our family drama and where she could make friends without the stigma of being the poor kid whose family was involved in scandalous lawsuits. But the most meaningful changes were emotional rather than financial. Emma's anxiety disappeared as our life stabilized, and her confidence returned as she realized that the scary court proceedings were finally over. Her stutter disappeared, her nightmares stopped, and she began asking questions about college and careers with the optimism of a child who believed in her own future. The impact on my parents was swift and public. News of their inheritance fraud conviction spread through Scottsdale's social circles like wildfire, destroying the respectable image they'd spent decades building. Richard's real estate business suffered as clients questioned his integrity, and Margaret was quietly asked to resign from several charity boards. Their social isolation was largely self-imposed, as they retreated from community involvement rather than face questions about their treatment of their granddaughter. Daniel surprised everyone by reaching out 3 months after the court case ended, asking to meet for coffee to discuss our relationship going forward. He looked haggard and older, clearly affected by the family's public disgrace and his role in the harassment campaign against Emma and me. "I'm ashamed of what I did," he said, unable to meet my eyes as we sat in a neutral coffee shop far from our childhood neighborhood. "I let them convince me that you were the problem, that you were trying to destroy the family for money. I should have known better." His apology felt genuine, but rebuilding trust would take time. "You helped them try to take Emma away from me," I reminded him. "You participated in a campaign to make a 5-year-old child homeless and motherless. That's not something I can just forgive and forget." But Daniel was determined to make amends, starting with establishing a real relationship with Emma. He began visiting us regularly, bringing age-appropriate gifts and showing genuine interest in her life and activities. Emma was cautious at first, remembering the trauma of the court proceedings, but gradually warmed to having an uncle who actually wanted to know her. Jennifer's relationship with our family proved more complicated. Her decision to testify against our parents had been crucial to our victory, but it had cost her everything she'd built her adult life around. Her marriage ended when her husband chose loyalty to our parents over loyalty to her, and her financial security disappeared when they cut off her trust fund distributions. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she told me during one of our awkward reconciliation meetings. "I participated in hurting you and Emma for years. I chose money and family approval over doing what was right." But Jennifer was working to rebuild her life independently, getting her first real job at 28 and learning to live without the financial safety net she'd always taken for granted. Her efforts to establish a genuine relationship with Emma were patient and respectful, focused on earning trust rather than demanding instant acceptance. Mrs. Chen became Emma's honorary grandmother, the loving older woman who'd been missing from her life since my grandmother died. Emma spent afternoons after school at Mrs. Chen's house, learning to bake Chinese dumplings and listening to stories about different cultures and traditions. Mrs. Chen's grandmotherly love helped heal some of the damage caused by my parents' rejection. Uncle Martin also stepped into a grandfather-like role, teaching Emma about family history that extended beyond the Martinez name and legacy. Through him, Emma learned about her great-great-grandmother who'd immigrated from Mexico, her great-grandfather who'd been a teacher, and family traditions that had nothing to do with money or social status. The extended family we built through choice rather than blood proved more loving and supportive than the biological family that had rejected us. Emma grew up understanding that family wasn't defined by genetics or financial relationships, but by people who chose to love and support each other through difficult times. My parents never attempted to contact us after the court case ended. There were no birthday cards, no Christmas presents, no attempts at reconciliation or apology. Their silence spoke volumes about their true character and their priorities. Even faced with the reality of their granddaughter's existence and the damage their behavior had caused, they chose pride and stubbornness over love and healing. The inheritance money was carefully invested to ensure Emma's college education and provide long-term financial security. But more importantly, the legal victory had established Emma's worth and dignity in ways that would affect her entire life. She would never have to wonder if she was worthy of love or support. The court had officially validated her right to both. Emma's 6th birthday party was everything her 5th birthday hadn't been. Mrs. Chen, Uncle Martin, Daniel, Jennifer, Sarah and her family, and several new friends from school gathered in our backyard to celebrate. Emma blew out her candles surrounded by people who genuinely loved her, people who had chosen to be part of her life rather than being obligated by blood relationships. During the party, Emma asked me quietly, "Mommy, why didn't my other grandparents ever come to my parties?" It was a question I'd been dreading, but also one I was finally prepared to answer honestly. "Some people don't know how to love others, sweetheart," I told her. "It's not about you or anything you did wrong. It's about them not understanding what family really means." "But Mrs. Chen loves me like a grandma," Emma said thoughtfully. "And Uncle Martin brings me presents and teaches me things. So I do have grandparents, just different ones." Her wisdom about chosen family versus biological obligation amazed me. At 6 years old, Emma understood something that my parents had never learned, that love is demonstrated through actions, not claimed through genetics. The final lesson of our ordeal came during a conversation about forgiveness. Emma had been learning about forgiveness in Sunday school and asked if we should forgive her biological grandparents for the hurt they'd caused us. "Forgiveness is complicated," I told her. "It doesn't mean pretending that bad things didn't happen or letting people hurt you again. But it does mean not letting anger control your life. We can forgive them for ourselves while still protecting ourselves from people who might hurt us." Emma nodded seriously, then asked the question that showed how much she'd grown, "Will you teach me to be a better grandparent someday than they were to me?" Looking at my daughter's determined face, I realized that our victory wasn't just about money or legal justice. It was about breaking a cycle of conditional love and financial manipulation that might have continued for generations. Emma would grow up knowing that love isn't earned through compliance or lost through disappointing others. She would understand that family relationships should be based on mutual respect and genuine care. The inheritance my grandmother left wasn't just money, it was a foundation for Emma to build a life free from the emotional and financial control that had damaged our family for years. My parents thought they could steal that foundation and force us into poverty and dependence, but they'd only succeeded in teaching us that we were stronger than we'd ever imagined. As Emma ran around our backyard with friends who loved her unconditionally, I realized that we'd won something more valuable than any inheritance, the knowledge that we deserved better than what my parents had offered, and the courage to build the family we actually needed. The little girl who'd once whispered birthday wishes for grandparents who loved her had found them, just not in the places we'd originally looked. And the mother who'd once been too poor and powerless to protect her daughter from family rejection had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is fighting for what's right, regardless of the cost. What started with a hurtful text about skipping a birthday party had ended with Emma surrounded by people who would never miss her celebrations. My parents had intended to punish us for my teenage pregnancy, but instead they'd given us the opportunity to discover our own strength and build authentic relationships based on love rather than obligation. So tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my situation? Would you have fought for your child's inheritance, or would you have walked away to avoid the family drama? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right? Hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and subscribe for more real family stories that prove love isn't always about blood relationships. Share this with anyone who needs to hear that children deserve better than conditional love, and remember that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into. Thank you for listening to our story, and may you always have the courage to fight for what your children deserve.